The crimson stain spread across the tactical display like spilled wine on white silk. Lieutenant Colonel Maverick Reaper Volkov watched the blinking red dot hold position 3 clicks north of the extraction zone, her weathered fingers drumming against the composite armrest of her command chair. The dot hadn't moved in 17 minutes. In her 23 years of service, dots that stopped moving usually meant one of two things: equipment failure or death. Viper 6, this is Overwatch Actual. State your position and status, over. The radio crackled with static, then silence. Maverick's jaw tightened. She'd handpicked the pilot for this mission, Captain Thessaly Viper Nakamura, a former Marine Corps aviator who transitioned to Army aviation after a classified incident in the South China Sea. The kind of incident that left scars both visible and hidden. The operations tent buzzed with controlled chaos. Intelligence officers hunched over satellite feeds, their faces bathed in the blue glow of tactical displays. Communications specialists adjusted frequency dials with practiced precision. The air conditioning unit hummed against the oppressive heat of the unnamed forward operating base, somewhere in the mountainous region where 3 hostile nations converged like pieces of a deadly puzzle. "Sir, we've got multiple fast movers inbound from the north," reported Sergeant First Class Hayes, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Appears to be a standard recon pattern, but they're maintaining radio silence." Maverick's pale green eyes narrowed as she studied the overhead display. The friendly aircraft, 2 A-60 Blackhawks from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, had been dispatched for emergency extraction after Viper's last transmission. Her final words echoed in Maverick's mind. "Taking heavy fire from all directions. GPS is compromised. I'm going dark." That was 47 minutes ago. The Blackhawk's call signs were Devil 1 and Devil 2, piloted by some of the most skilled aviators in the military. They'd flown through hell and back, extracted Special Forces teams from impossible situations, and never left a pilot behind. But as Maverick watched their approach vectors on the tactical display, something felt different. Their formation was too tight, their altitude too high. They were flying like they were afraid. "Overwatch Actual, this is Devil 1, came the voice of Chief Warrant Officer Blake Morrison, the lead pilot. His usual cockiness was replaced by something Maverick had rarely heard from the Night Stalker veteran: uncertainty. "We've got visual on the crash site. Requesting permission to hold position and reassess." Maverick's blood ran cold. Crash site. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. She leaned forward, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her veins. "Devil 1, define crash site. What's your assessment of survivor probability?" The pause that followed stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Through the static, Maverick could hear the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades, the background chatter of a crew chief, and something else, a tremor in Morrison's breathing that spoke of things no pilot should have to witness. Captain Thessaly Nakamura had earned her call sign Viper, not for her aggressive flying style, but for her ability to remain motionless under pressure, striking only when the moment was perfect. She'd grown up in the mountains of Colorado, where her Japanese-American father had taught her to hunt elk with a rifle older than she was. Patience, he'd said, was the difference between coming home with dinner and coming home empty-handed. The military had refined that patience into something deadlier. Now, as she lay pressed against the rocky outcropping 30 meters from her downed A-64 Apache, Thessaly embodied that patience. Her flight suit was torn along the left shoulder, revealing a gash that had stopped bleeding an hour ago. Her helmet sat cracked beside her, the night vision system destroyed in the emergency landing. But her eyes, dark brown and alert, tracked the movement of hostile forces through the valley below with the precision of a sniper's scope. The Apache had taken a direct hit from what appeared to be a shoulder-fired missile, though the intelligence briefing had indicated no advanced surface-to-air capabilities in this region. The explosion had shattered her co-pilot's side of the cockpit, killing Chief Warrant Officer Danny Rodriguez instantly. The hydraulics had failed 3 seconds later, turning the $30 million aircraft into a barely controlled missile aimed at the mountainside. Thessaly had managed to level the aircraft just before impact, using every ounce of her training to convert a vertical death spiral into a survivable crash landing. The Apache had skidded across the rocky terrain, shedding armor plating and rotor blades like a wounded animal shedding fur. When the dust settled, she'd found herself alive but alone, surrounded by mountains that seemed to reach toward heaven with stone fingers. Her survival radio had been damaged in the crash, limiting her range to less than 5 miles. She'd made contact with Overwatch Actual once, reporting her position and status, but the battery had died during transmission. Now she was effectively a ghost, invisible to friendly forces and increasingly visible to the enemy patrols that had been systematically searching the crash site for the past hour. Through her rifle scope, a backup system she'd removed from the Apache's weapon controls, Thessaly observed the organized movement of at least 15 hostile combatants. They wore no identifying uniforms, but their equipment was modern and their tactics were professional. These weren't local militia or hastily organized insurgents. These were trained soldiers, possibly special forces, and they were closing in on her position with methodical precision. The sound of approaching helicopters caused Thessaly to shift her position slightly, peering skyward through the gap in the rocky overhang that concealed her. 2 Blackhawks materialized against the afternoon sky, their familiar silhouettes a welcome sight. But as they drew closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The helicopters weren't moving like they were conducting a combat search and rescue. They were moving like they were approaching a crime scene. Devil 1 and Devil 2 established a wide orbit around the crash site, their crews undoubtedly scanning the wreckage below. From her concealed position, Thessaly could see the Apache's twisted frame, the scattered debris field, and the dark stain in the dirt where Rodriguez had died. She wanted to signal the helicopters, to let them know she was alive and capable of extraction, but something held her back. The hostile forces had gone silent. In the space of 30 seconds, 15 armed combatants had melted into the landscape like smoke. No visual movement, no radio chatter, no tactical repositioning. They'd simply vanished, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the mountain passes and the distant sound of rotor blades. Thessaly's father had taught her to read the mountains, to understand their moods and rhythms. Mountains didn't lie, he'd said. They revealed truth to those patient enough to listen. Now, as she pressed her ear to the stone and felt the subtle vibrations of the earth, she understood what the mountains were telling her. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a recovery operation. The realization hit her like a punch to the solar plexus. Command believed she was dead. The Black Hawks weren't here to extract a survivor. They were here to secure the crash site and prevent sensitive technology from falling into enemy hands. The Apache's targeting systems, classified communication equipment, and advanced defensive countermeasures were worth more than her life in the grand calculus of modern warfare. But there was something else, something that made her skin crawl with an inexplicable sense of dread. The way the helicopters maintained their distance, the cautious positioning of their crews, the obvious reluctance to approach the wreckage, it all suggested they were looking for something specific, something that had them spooked. Through her scope, Thessaly watched as Devil 1 began a slow descent toward the crash site. The crew chief was leaning out of the aircraft, scanning the ground with what appeared to be binoculars or a spotting scope. His body language was tense, alert, like a man expecting to find something terrible. That's when she saw it. Painted on the side of the Apache's cockpit, barely visible through the smoke damage and scoring, was her personal emblem, a coiled serpent with blood-red scales, the same design that adorned her flight helmet and uniform patches. It was a symbol she'd chosen after her first combat deployment, a reminder of the precision and patience required to survive in a world where hesitation meant death. But to the aircrew circling above, that emblem meant something entirely different. It meant they were looking at the crash site of Captain Thessaly Viper Nakamura, the pilot who'd single-handedly destroyed an entire armored column in Syria. The pilot who'd extracted a downed Special Forces team from behind enemy lines in Afghanistan while taking fire from 3 directions. The pilot who'd become a legend in aviation circles, whispered about in bars and briefing rooms with the kind of reverence reserved for the truly exceptional. And legends, Thessaly realized, were never supposed to die in routine missions. The radio crackled to life with a transmission that chilled her to the bone. Overwatch Actual, this is Devil One. We've confirmed the aircraft registration. This is Viper's Bird. I repeat, this is Viper's Apache. The pause that followed was heavy with implication. Then Morrison's voice returned, lower and more cautious. Sir, we need to talk about the emblem, the blood serpent. It's intact. Thessaly's breath caught in her throat. The emblem was intact, despite the crash, despite the fire, despite the twisted metal and shattered glass. In the superstitious world of military aviation, where pilots carried lucky coins and refused to fly on certain dates, an intact emblem on a crashed aircraft meant something profound. It meant the pilot's spirit was still fighting. From her concealed position, Thessaly watched as the Blackhawk's formation shifted subtly. They were no longer circling the crash site with the mechanical precision of a recovery operation. They were orbiting with the careful reverence of a funeral procession, their crews undoubtedly struggling to process the sight below. The woman who'd earned her wings in the most challenging training program in the world, who'd survived 3 combat deployments without a single loss of life under her command, who'd become the benchmark against which other pilots measured their own skills. That woman was supposed to be invincible. But invincible didn't mean immortal. Morrison's voice cut through the static again, this time addressing his crew. Devil 2, maintain your position. Nobody approaches the wreckage until we've assessed the tactical situation. Something doesn't feel right about this. Thessaly pressed herself deeper into the rocky crevice, her mind racing through the implications. The rescue helicopters were treating her crash site like a potential trap, maintaining distance and conducting reconnaissance from altitude. In their world, caution was the difference between completing a mission and becoming casualties themselves. But their caution was also her opportunity. Using hand signals she'd learned in survival training, Thessaly began to inventory her resources. 1 service pistol with 2 magazines, 1 combat knife, 1 emergency medical kit, 1 water purification tablet, 1 signal mirror, 1 emergency flare, and most importantly, 1 unbroken will to survive. The hostile forces were still out there, invisible but present. The rescue helicopters were maintaining their distance, treating the crash site like a potential ambush. And somewhere in the mountains, enemy reinforcements were undoubtedly being mobilized to secure the valuable technology scattered across the landscape. Thessaly closed her eyes and listened to the mountains. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The mountain doesn't care about your plans, your equipment, or your training. The mountain only cares about your will to live. Her will to live was unbroken. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, Thessaly made her decision. She wouldn't wait for rescue. She wouldn't hide in the rocks like a wounded animal. She would do what she'd always done. She would fight. But first, she needed to understand what had the rescue helicopters so spooked. Moving with the fluid grace of a predator, Thessaly began to work her way toward the crash site. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to avoid detection by both friendly and enemy forces. The rocks provided excellent concealment, but they also created acoustic shadows that could mask the approach of hostile combatants. As she moved, fragments of her recent past began to surface in her mind. The mission briefing had been routine: provide close air support for a classified ground operation, neutralize specific targets, and return to base. No mention of advanced surface-to-air capabilities. No indication of organized resistance. No suggestion that she was flying into anything more dangerous than a standard counterinsurgency operation. But the missile that had destroyed her Apache had been fired with professional precision. The hostile forces searching the crash site moved with military discipline, and the rescue helicopters were treating the entire area like a potential war zone. Someone had set a trap, and she'd flown directly into it. The question was, had the trap been set for her specifically, or had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? As she reached the edge of the debris field, Thessaly found her answer. Scattered among the twisted metal and shattered glass were pieces of equipment that shouldn't have been there: advanced communication devices, surveillance equipment, and what appeared to be components from a sophisticated electronic warfare system. Her Apache hadn't been shot down during a routine mission. It had been shot down while carrying classified technology to a specific location for a specific purpose. The ground operation she'd been supporting wasn't counterinsurgency. It was intelligence gathering, and she'd been the delivery mechanism. The realization changed everything. The hostile forces weren't random combatants. They were professionals tasked with recovering the same technology she'd been carrying. The rescue helicopters weren't being cautious. They were being careful not to compromise an ongoing classified operation. And the emblem of blood that had the aircrew so spooked, it wasn't just a symbol of her reputation as a pilot. It was a marker that identified her as someone who'd been read into operations that officially didn't exist. Thessaly smiled grimly as she processed the implications. She wasn't just a downed pilot waiting for rescue. She was a high-value asset in possession of classified information that multiple parties wanted to either recover or destroy. The game had changed, and she was no longer playing defense. Moving with renewed purpose, Thessaly began to collect the scattered technology, prioritizing the devices that appeared most sensitive. If hostile forces wanted to recover classified equipment, they'd have to go through her first. If friendly forces wanted to secure the crash site, they'd have to acknowledge that she was alive and capable of resistance. Either way, she was done being a victim. As she worked, the sound of approaching aircraft caused her to freeze. But these weren't the familiar rotors of American helicopters. These were the distinctive sounds of foreign aircraft, lighter, faster, with the characteristic whine of turbine engines pushed to their operational limits. Through the gathering dusk, Thessaly watched as 3 helicopters approached from the north. Their silhouettes were unfamiliar, but their aggressive formation and low-altitude approach suggested hostile intent. The professional forces that had been searching the crash site were being reinforced, and the window for extraction was closing rapidly. Devil 1 and Devil 2 immediately adjusted their positions, gaining altitude and establishing a defensive perimeter. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio frequency she'd been monitoring. "Overwatch Actual, we've got multiple inbound aircraft from the north. Appears to be a hostile extraction team. Request immediate air support." The response was immediate and decisive. "Devil 1, you are cleared to engage. Protect the crash site at all costs. Viper's technology cannot fall into enemy hands." Thessaly felt a cold smile spread across her face. Command had just confirmed what she'd suspected. The technology was more important than her life. But they'd also given her something valuable: proof that friendly forces were committed to preventing enemy recovery of the classified equipment. She was no longer alone in this fight. The first exchange of fire lit up the evening sky like a deadly fireworks display. Tracer rounds streaked between the aircraft as the American helicopters engaged the hostile forces with precision fire. The unknown aircraft responded with surface-to-air missiles, their contrails visible against the darkening sky. From her position in the rocks, Thessaly had a perfect view of the aerial combat. The American crews were skilled, but they were outnumbered and operating in unfamiliar terrain. The hostile aircraft were aggressive, But they were also protecting something valuable, the ground forces that had been searching the crash site. It was a perfect stalemate, and Thessaly held the key to breaking it. Checking her equipment one final time, she began to move toward the Apache's wreckage. The classified technology was her bargaining chip, her insurance policy, and her weapon all rolled into one. But to use it effectively, she needed to reach the aircraft's communication system. The Apache's radio had been damaged in the crash, but it wasn't destroyed. With the right modifications, she could establish contact with friendly forces and coordinate a synchronized strike against the hostile ground teams. The aerial battle would provide cover for her movement, and the ground forces would be distracted by the threat from above. It was a dangerous plan, but it was also her only option. As she reached the Apache's cockpit, Thessaly paused to look at Rodriguez's body. Her co-pilot had died instantly, his face peaceful despite the violence of their final moments together. She'd flown with him for 2 years, trusted him with her life, and watched him die protecting classified technology that neither of them fully understood. "I'm sorry, Danny," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of distant gunfire. "I'm going to finish this." Working quickly, she began to modify the Apache's communication system. The damage was extensive, but not insurmountable. With components from the scattered technology and improvised connections, she could establish a short-range radio link with the circling helicopters. The key was timing. She needed to wait for the right moment, when the hostile aircraft were committed to their attack and the ground forces were focused on the aerial battle. Only then could she establish communication without revealing her position to enemy forces. Above her, the battle intensified. Devil One had taken a glancing hit from a missile, smoke trailing from its tail rotor. Devil Two was providing covering fire, but the hostile aircraft were closing in for a killing blow. The American helicopters were running out of ammunition, altitude, and options. Thessaly's fingers flew across the makeshift controls, finalizing her modifications to the communication system. The improvised radio crackled to life, filled with static and interference, but functional. She could hear the voices of the American crews, their professional calm masking the desperation of their situation. "Devil 2, I'm showing hydraulic failure on the primary system." Morrison's voice was steady, but Thessaly could hear the strain beneath the words. "We need to break contact and establish a new position." "Devil 1, this is Devil 2. I'm Winchester on missiles. We can't maintain this position much longer." That was her cue. Thessaly keyed the radio, her voice cutting through the static with crystal clarity. "Devil 1, Devil 2, this is Viper. I'm alive and in position at the crash site. I have eyes on hostile ground forces and control of classified technology, ready to coordinate ground-to-air strike." The silence that followed was more profound than any explosion. For a moment, the entire battle seemed to pause as the implications of her transmission sank in. Then Morrison's voice returned, filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Viper, this is Devil One. Say again. Are you saying you're alive and operational?" "Confirmed, Devil One. I'm alive, I'm armed, and I'm ready to fight. But I need immediate air support to neutralize the ground threat. There are at least 15 hostiles in concealed positions around the crash site." The response came from multiple sources simultaneously. Morrison's voice: "Roger that, Viper, we're repositioning for close air support." The voice of Devil 2's pilot: "Viper, this is actual proof that legends don't die easy." And from Overwatch Actual, transmitted through the orbiting helicopters: "Viper, this is Colonel Volkov. You are cleared to engage. Repeat, you are cleared to engage." Thessaly smiled as she began to mark target positions with her laser designator. The hostile ground forces had made a fatal error. They'd assumed she was dead, focusing their attention on the aerial battle while ignoring the threat from the crash site itself. They were about to learn why she'd earned the call sign Viper. The coordinated strike began with devastating precision. Thessaly's laser designator painted targets while the circling helicopters engaged with rocket fire and chain gun bursts. The hostile ground forces, caught in the open during their attempted advance on the crash site, were systematically eliminated by the combined air-ground assault. But the hostile aircraft weren't finished. As their ground support was being destroyed, they made a desperate attack run on the crash site itself. If they couldn't recover the classified technology, they would destroy it. Thessaly watched the incoming aircraft through her scope, calculating their approach vector and timing. They were flying low and fast, probably armed with incendiary weapons designed to obliterate the Apache and everything around it. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the crash site. Time slowed as she made her decision. The classified technology was scattered across 100 meters of rocky terrain. She couldn't protect all of it, but she could protect the most sensitive components. Grabbing the most critical devices, she began to run toward the rocky outcropping that had sheltered her earlier. The hostile aircraft opened fire as she moved, their rockets and cannon rounds churning the earth around the crash site. The Apache's wreckage disappeared in a ball of flame and smoke, taking with it any hope of recovering the remaining technology. But Thessaly had reached safety with the most important components, and the American helicopters were closing in for the kill. Devil 1 and Devil 2 engaged the hostile aircraft in a close-range dogfight that would have been impossible in any other circumstances. The mountain terrain provided cover and concealment, but it also created deadly obstacles for aircraft moving at high speed. The American crews used their superior training and knowledge of the local terrain to force the hostile aircraft into an increasingly disadvantageous position. The end came quickly. One hostile aircraft, attempting to escape through a narrow mountain pass, collided with a rock face and exploded in a brilliant fireball. The second aircraft, pursued by Devil 2, was destroyed by a direct hit from a Hellfire missile. The third aircraft, realizing the hopelessness of its situation, attempted to withdraw from the area but was intercepted by Devil 1 and destroyed before it could escape. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of the battle faded into the mountain silence, Thessaly emerged from her rocky shelter. The classified technology was secure, the hostile forces were neutralized, and the rescue helicopters were finally free to conduct their primary mission. But as Devil 1 began its approach to the crash site, Thessaly realized that her ordeal was far from over. The battle had been won, but the war, the larger conflict that had brought her to this remote mountain in the first place, was still being fought. Morrison's voice crackled through her radio. "Viper, this is Devil 1. We're inbound for extraction. What's your status?" Thessaly looked at the burning wreckage of the Apache, the scattered bodies of the hostile ground forces, and the classified technology that had cost so many lives to protect. Her status was complicated. She was alive, but her co-pilot was dead. She was victorious, but her aircraft was destroyed. She was a survivor, but she was also a witness to something that officially had never happened. "Devil 1, this is Viper," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I'm operational and ready for extraction, but we need to talk about what really happened here." The pause that followed was filled with the sound of approaching rotor blades and the distant crackle of burning metal. Then Morrison's voice returned, quieter and more serious. "Roger that, Viper. We'll talk when you're aboard, but first, we need to get you out of here." As the Blackhawk touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash, Thessaly realized that her survival had changed everything. She was no longer just a pilot who'd been shot down during a routine mission. She was a witness to a classified operation that had gone wrong, a survivor of a battle that had never officially occurred, and a keeper of secrets that could reshape the balance of power in the region. The crew chief extended his hand to help her aboard, but Thessaly paused at the threshold of the aircraft. Looking back at the crash site, she saw the blood-red emblem painted on a piece of wreckage that had survived the explosion. The coiled serpent seemed to be watching her, its painted eyes reflecting the flames of the burning Apache. In that moment, she understood why the rescue helicopters had been so spooked by the intact emblem. It wasn't just a symbol of her reputation as a pilot. It was a reminder that some battles are fought in the shadows, some victories are never acknowledged, and some legends are born from the blood of those who die protecting secrets that the world must never know. She climbed aboard the helicopter, but she knew her real journey was just beginning. As Devil One lifted off from the crash site, Thessaly watched the burning wreckage disappear into the darkness below. The classified technology was secure, the hostile forces were neutralized, and she was alive, but the cost of victory was measured in more than just lives and equipment. The operation she'd been supporting didn't exist in any official record. The battle she'd fought had never happened. The technology she'd protected was so sensitive that its very existence was classified beyond her clearance level. And the enemy forces she'd helped defeat were professional soldiers whose nationality and affiliation would never be acknowledged. She was a ghost who'd survived a battle between shadows, carrying secrets that could never be shared and memories that could never be officially recorded. But as the helicopter carried her toward safety, Thessaly realized that her survival had given her something more valuable than official recognition or public acclaim. She'd proven to herself that when everything else failed, when her aircraft was destroyed, her co-pilot was dead, and her survival depended entirely on her own skill and determination, she'd found a way to win. The emblem of blood that had spooked the rescue helicopters wasn't just a symbol of her reputation. It was a reminder that legends aren't born from easy victories or safe missions. They're forged in the crucible of impossible odds, tempered by the blood of those who refuse to surrender, and refined by the fire of battles that test every aspect of a warrior's soul. Captain Thessaly, Viper, Nakamura had entered the battle as a skilled pilot with a distinguished record. She was leaving it as something more, a living legend whose name would be whispered in briefing rooms and barracks for generations to come. The blood-red serpent had struck, and the mountains would remember. In the days that followed her extraction, Thessaly found herself in a strange kind of limbo. The official report stated that she'd been shot down during a routine support mission, that she'd survived the crash and evaded hostile forces until rescue arrived, and that classified technology had been successfully recovered. The truth, that she'd single-handedly coordinated a combined arms assault that had neutralized a professional enemy force while protecting technology that could shift the balance of power in the region, was buried beneath layers of classification that made it effectively invisible. But invisibility didn't mean irrelevance. Colonel Maverick Volkov visited her in the medical facility where she was recovering from her injuries. The conversation was brief, professional, and filled with the kind of subtext that characterized all interactions involving classified operations. "The technology you protected was more important than you know," Volkov said, her pale green eyes reflecting a mixture of respect and concern. "The enemy forces you helped defeat were more dangerous than we initially assessed, and your actions during the engagement exceeded every expectation we had." Thessaly nodded, understanding the implications. She'd been tested in the crucible of combat and had emerged as something more than a skilled pilot. She'd become a strategic asset, a weapon that could be deployed in situations where conventional forces were insufficient. "What happens now?" she asked. Volkov smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Now you heal, then you train, then you wait for the next mission that officially doesn't exist." As the colonel left, Thessaly realized that her survival had changed more than just her own life. The battle in the mountains had demonstrated that enemy forces were operating with capabilities and coordination that exceeded intelligence estimates. The technology she'd protected was apparently critical to maintaining American technological superiority in an increasingly competitive global environment. And her own performance had proven that individual skill and determination could still make a difference in an age of advanced weapons and electronic warfare. She was no longer just Captain Thessaly Nakamura, skilled pilot and decorated veteran. She was Viper, a legend whose reputation would precede her into every future battle, whose presence would inspire confidence in friendly forces and strike fear into the hearts of enemies. The emblem of blood had become more than a personal symbol. It had become a promise to allies that she would never abandon the fight, and to enemies that she would never show mercy. Weeks later, as Thessaly returned to flight status and began preparing for her next assignment, she received an unexpected visitor. Chief Warrant Officer Blake Morrison, the pilot of Devil One, appeared at her quarters with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you should have this," he said, handing her the package. "We recovered it from the crash site after the area was secured." Inside the package was a piece of twisted metal, painted with the unmistakable image of a blood-red serpent. The emblem had been carefully cut from the wreckage of her Apache, its painted surface scarred but intact. "The boys in my unit wanted me to tell you something," Morrison continued. "They said that when they saw that emblem in the flames, when they realized that Viper had survived the crash and was still fighting, it changed everything. They said it reminded them why they became pilots in the first place." Thessaly held the metal fragment, feeling its weight and texture. It was more than a piece of wreckage. It was a testament to the power of will over circumstances, of determination over adversity, of the human spirit over the machines of war. "What did it remind them of?" she asked. Morrison smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in the expression. "That legends aren't born from easy victories. They're forged in the fire of impossible odds, and they're recognized by those who witness them refuse to surrender." As Morrison left, Thessaly placed the metal fragment on her desk next to her flight helmet. The blood-red serpent watched her with painted eyes that seemed to reflect the flames of a distant battle, a reminder that some victories are measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the will to continue fighting when everything else has been lost. The emblem had become her legacy, but more than that, it had become a symbol of something larger. The idea that courage and skill could still triumph over superior numbers and advanced technology, that individual determination could still make a difference in an age of mass warfare, and that legends were still being born in the crucible of combat. Captain Thessaly, Viper, Nakamura had survived the crash, won the battle, and protected the technology. But her greatest victory was in proving that the human spirit, tested, refined, and strengthened by adversity, remained the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. The blood-red serpent had struck, and the world would never be the same. Years passed, and the legend of Viper continued to grow. New pilots entering the service heard whispered stories of the woman who'd single-handedly held off an entire enemy force while coordinating air support from the wreckage of her own aircraft. Flight instructors used her tactics as examples of how to survive in impossible situations. Intelligence analysts studied her engagement to better understand enemy capabilities and intentions. But for Thessaly herself, the battle in the mountains had become something more personal, a defining moment that had revealed not just her capabilities as a pilot, but her character as a human being. She discovered that when everything else was stripped away, her aircraft, her technology, her support systems, she still possessed the will to fight and the skill to win. The emblem of blood had become her calling card, her signature on every mission she flew. Enemy forces learned to recognize the distinctive red serpent painted on her aircraft, and friendly forces took comfort in its presence. It was a symbol that transcended nationality, ideology, and political affiliation, a reminder that courage and competence could still triumph over superior numbers and advanced technology. As her career progressed, Thessaly found herself increasingly involved in the kind of missions that officially didn't exist. She flew classified operations in unnamed countries, supported special forces teams in hostile territory, and protected technology that could shift the balance of power in the global community. Each mission added another layer to her legend, another story to be whispered in briefing rooms and barracks. But she never forgot the lesson of the mountains, that legends weren't born from easy victories, but from the willingness to fight when victory seemed impossible, to continue when continuation seemed pointless, and to strike when striking seemed suicidal. The blood-red serpent had taught her that patience and precision were more valuable than speed and power, that waiting for the right moment was more important than acting quickly, and that the ability to remain calm under pressure was the most critical skill any warrior could possess. And so Captain Thessaly, Viper, Nakamura continued to fly, continued to fight, and continued to win battles that would never be officially acknowledged. Her name became synonymous with victory in impossible circumstances. Her emblem became a symbol of hope for friendly forces and fear for enemies. And her legend became a reminder that the human spirit, tested, refined, and strengthened by adversity, remained the most powerful force in any conflict. The black hawks that had once frozen at the sight of her emblem now flew with confidence when she was in the area. The mountains that had witnessed her survival now echoed with stories of her courage. And the blood-red serpent that had marked her aircraft continued to strike fear into the hearts of those who would threaten the innocent and inspire confidence in those who stood ready to defend them. In the end, the emblem of blood had become more than just a symbol. It had become a promise that as long as warriors like Thessaly Nakamura were willing to fight, freedom would always find a way to prevail over tyranny, courage would always triumph over cowardice, and legends would always be born from the blood of those who refused to surrender. The serpent had struck, and the world was safer for its presence. 20 years later, Colonel Thessaly, Viper, Nakamura stood before a group of newly commissioned pilots at the Advanced Flight Training Center. Her hair was streaked with silver, her face bore the lines of someone who'd seen too much combat, and her eyes held the quiet confidence of a warrior who'd been tested in the crucible of battle and emerged victorious. On the wall behind her hung a display case containing a piece of twisted metal painted with the image of a blood-red serpent. The emblem was scarred and weathered, but it remained intact, a testament to the power of will over circumstances, of determination over adversity, and of the human spirit over the machines of war. The young pilots before her represented the future of military aviation, men and women who would face challenges that she could only imagine, who would fly aircraft that pushed the boundaries of technology and human capability, and who would be tested in ways that would define not just their careers, but their character. "You've all heard the stories," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak about combat through personal experience. "You've heard about the missions that officially didn't happen, the battles that were never recorded, and the warriors who became legends through their actions rather than their words." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the faces before her. Each pilot wore the same expression she'd worn decades earlier, a mixture of confidence and uncertainty, of excitement and apprehension, of professional competence and personal doubt. They were skilled, trained, and ready for combat, but they hadn't yet been tested in the crucible that would forge them into something more than mere pilots. "I'm here to tell you that the stories are true, but they're not the whole truth. The whole truth is that legends aren't born from single acts of heroism or moments of exceptional skill. They're forged through years of dedication, refined through countless hours of training, and proven through the willingness to fight when fighting seems impossible." Behind her, the blood-red serpent seemed to watch the young pilots with painted eyes that reflected the wisdom of hard-won experience. The emblem had become more than a personal symbol. It had become a teaching tool, a reminder that courage and competence could still triumph over superior numbers and advanced technology. "The emblem behind me was recovered from the wreckage of my aircraft after a battle that officially never happened," Thessaly continued. "It survived the crash, the fire, and the explosion that destroyed everything else. But more than that, it survived because it represented something that couldn't be destroyed, the will to fight when everything else had been lost. She turned to face the display case, her reflection superimposed over the scarred metal. This emblem taught me that patience and precision are more valuable than speed and power, that waiting for the right moment is more important than acting quickly, and that the ability to remain calm under pressure is the most critical skill any warrior can possess. The young pilots listened with the kind of attention that came from recognizing truth when they heard it. They'd all chosen military aviation because they wanted to make a difference, to serve something larger than themselves, and to test their skills against the most challenging adversaries the world could offer. But they hadn't yet learned that the greatest adversary they would face was their own capacity for doubt, fear, and despair. "You'll face moments when victory seems impossible," Thessaly said, turning back to face the group. "You'll encounter situations where your training, your equipment, and your support systems all fail simultaneously. You'll be tested in ways that will push you beyond every limit you thought you possessed." She paused, remembering the weight of the rocks pressing against her back, the sound of hostile forces closing in, and the moment when she'd realized that survival depended entirely on her own skill and determination. In those moments, you'll discover what you're truly made of. You'll learn whether you have the will to continue fighting when continuation seems pointless, the courage to strike when striking seems suicidal, and the wisdom to remain patient when patience seems impossible. The blood-red serpent had taught her those lessons through fire and blood, through loss and survival, through the kind of trial that revealed character in ways that no training exercise could duplicate. But the lessons themselves were universal, applicable to any warrior who would face the ultimate test of combat. "The emblem behind me is scarred and weathered, but it remains intact," she concluded. "It's a reminder that the human spirit, tested, refined, and strengthened by adversity, remains the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. It's a promise that as long as warriors like yourselves are willing to fight, freedom will always find a way to prevail over tyranny, courage will always triumph over cowardice, and legends will always be born from the blood of those who refuse to surrender." As the young pilots filed out of the briefing room, several paused to examine the display case more closely. They studied the scarred metal, the faded paint, and the eyes of the serpent that seemed to follow their movement. Each pilot was undoubtedly wondering whether they would have the courage to face the kind of trial that had forged this legend, whether they possessed the character to survive when survival seemed impossible. But Thessaly knew that wondering was not the same as knowing. Character could only be proven through testing, courage could only be demonstrated through action, and legends could only be born through the willingness to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. The blood-red serpent would continue to watch over future generations of pilots, reminding them that some battles are fought in the shadows, some victories are never acknowledged, and some legends are born from the blood of those who die protecting secrets that the world must never know. But it would also remind them that the human spirit, tested in the crucible of combat, refined through years of dedication, and strengthened through the willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than oneself, remained the most powerful force in any conflict. The emblem of blood had become more than a symbol. It had become a legacy, passed from one generation of warriors to the next, carrying with it the promise that courage and competence would always triumph over superior numbers and advanced technology, that individual determination could still make a difference in an age of mass warfare, and that legends would always be born from the blood of those who refused to surrender. The serpent had struck, and its venom would continue to flow through the veins of every pilot who chose to serve something larger than themselves. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was the first to approach the display case after the briefing ended. Her reflection overlapped with the image of the blood-red serpent, creating a visual metaphor that wasn't lost on Colonel Nakamura. The young pilot's eyes held the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that Thessaly had seen in her own reflection decades earlier. "Ma'am," Chen said, her voice respectful but curious. "The emblem, did you choose the serpent because of its symbolic meaning, or was there a more personal reason?" Thessaly smiled, remembering her own questions as a young pilot. "Both," she replied. "The serpent represents patience, precision, and the ability to strike at the perfect moment. But more than that, it represents the willingness to shed one's skin, to transform from what you were into what you need to become." Chen nodded, understanding the implication. Military aviation demanded constant evolution, constant adaptation, constant growth. The pilots who survived were those who could shed their old assumptions, old limitations, and old fears in favor of new capabilities, new understanding, and new courage. "The blood-red coloring," Chen continued, "was that symbolic too?" "The blood is real," Thessaly replied quietly. "It represents the price of transformation, the cost of growth, and the sacrifice required to become something more than what you were. Every legend is written in blood, sometimes your own, sometimes that of your enemies, sometimes that of your friends who didn't survive to see the victory." The young pilot's expression sobered as she processed the implications. She'd chosen military aviation because she wanted to make a difference, to serve something larger than herself, and to test her skills against the most challenging adversaries the world could offer. But she hadn't yet learned that the greatest test would be her willingness to pay the price of transformation, to shed her old self in favor of something harder, stronger, and more capable. "How do you know when you're ready?" Chen asked. "How do you know when you've transformed enough to face the kind of trial that creates legends?" Thessaly considered the question, remembering her own journey from confident young pilot to battle-tested veteran. "You never know," she said finally. "Readiness isn't something you achieve, it's something you discover. You discover it in the moment when everything else fails, when your training, your equipment, and your support systems all collapse simultaneously, and you realize that survival depends entirely on who you've become." The blood-red serpent seemed to nod in agreement, its painted eyes reflecting the wisdom of hard-won experience. The emblem had witnessed the transformation of countless pilots, had seen them shed their old selves in favor of something stronger, and had watched them emerge from the crucible of combat as something more than mere warriors. "The emblem will watch over you," Thessaly said, placing her hand on Chen's shoulder. "It will remind you that patience and precision are more valuable than speed and power, that waiting for the right moment is more important than acting quickly, and that the ability to remain calm under pressure is the most critical skill any warrior can possess." As Chen left the briefing room, Thessaly remained behind, studying the display case that had become her legacy. The blood-red serpent watched her with painted eyes that held the memory of every battle she'd fought, every victory she'd won, and every loss she'd endured. It was a reminder that legends weren't born from single acts of heroism, but from the willingness to continue fighting when fighting seemed impossible. The emblem had become more than a personal symbol. It had become a teaching tool, a source of inspiration, and a promise that the human spirit, tested in the crucible of combat, refined through years of dedication, and strengthened through the willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than oneself, remained the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. The serpent had struck, and its legacy would continue to inspire future generations of warriors who chose to serve something larger than themselves. Decades later, when Colonel Thessaly, Viper, Nakamura had long since retired from active duty, the emblem of blood continued to watch over new generations of pilots. The display case had been moved to the entrance of the Advanced Flight Training Center, where every pilot who entered would see it and remember the lessons it represented. The stories of her survival, her courage, and her skill had become legend, passed from instructor to student, from veteran to rookie, from one generation of warriors to the next. But the emblem itself had become something more, a tangible reminder that the human spirit, tested and refined through adversity, remained the most powerful force in any conflict. Young pilots would pause before the display case, studying the scarred metal and the faded paint, wondering whether they had the courage to face the kind of trial that had forged this legend. Veterans would salute the emblem, remembering their own battles and the moments when they discovered what they were truly made of. And instructors would use it as a teaching tool, reminding their students that legends weren't born from easy victories, but from the willingness to fight when fighting seemed impossible. The blood-red serpent had become immortal, its painted eyes watching over every pilot who chose to serve something larger than themselves. It was a promise that courage and competence would always triumph over superior numbers and advanced technology, that individual determination could still make a difference in an age of mass warfare, and that legends would always be born from the blood of those who refused to surrender. The serpent had struck, and the world was forever changed by its presence. In the end, the emblem of blood had become more than a symbol of one pilot's courage. It had become a testament to the power of the human spirit, a reminder that legends are forged in the crucible of adversity, and a promise that as long as warriors are willing to fight for something greater than themselves, freedom will always find a way to prevail. The Blackhawks that had once frozen at the sight of the emblem now flew with confidence, knowing that the spirit it represented would always be with them. The mountains that had witnessed its birth continued to echo with stories of courage and determination, and the blood-red serpent that had marked the beginning of a legend continued to inspire new generations of warriors who chose to serve something larger than themselves. The emblem had become eternal, its message transcending time, nationality, and ideology. It was a reminder that some battles are fought in the shadows, some victories are never acknowledged, and some legends are born from the blood of those who die protecting secrets that the world must never know. But it was also a promise that the human spirit, tested, refined, and strengthened by adversity, would always find a way to triumph over the forces of darkness, that courage would always overcome cowardice, and that legends would always be born from the blood of those who refused to surrender. The serpent had struck, and its venom would flow through the veins of every warrior who chose to serve something greater than themselves for generations to come.